more from the perspective of an A-level teacher, and the features you might want to know about if you're considering using it in the A-level economics classroom. So I think I'm going to just show you what it looks like from a student login, because I think there's more than enough here to give you a decent overview to be getting on with. I'll focus mainly on the economy book, which is the main core textbook, but we will also at the end have a look at some of the interesting features as well. So this is what it looks like when students log in. There are a couple of options here, but I'm just going to click read the free ebook. I like that it kind of tells you where you were last time. I like that. So you can kind of go back to your place. But anyway, click read, and there's the contents. So I think as a teacher, it's really useful if you look at the preface and the note to instructors first. So the preface sort of helps you understand the thinking behind the core and why it focuses on what it does and what it aims to do. I found that reading through this does throw up quite a few questions on how well the standard A level produces good economists. If you just taught the spec completely as is without any extra bits, how well that necessarily produces good economists and economists who understand relevant economics. And I think we can perhaps build on that and kind of turn the A level into something a little bit richer. I found it really interesting to see how they've kind of made this different course and the ideas behind it. So that's the preface, kind of explains the why, whereas the note to instructors is more about the how they've kind of structured the course and how the beliefs are fed through into the textbook. I should say right now that it's very, very unlikely that you are going to throw out your old textbook and just use this, because it is designed as a university text in the whole. So there are lots and lots of topics that don't match up to the A-level spec. There's a lot of focus on kind of indifference curves or whatever that we don't really look at. But that doesn't mean that some of it can't be really, really useful as a teacher. So there are kind of key themes, and these dots are kind of colour-coded on different pages, and so you can kind of see where these themes come up. But I mean, looking at these themes, these are big elements of the A-level. So you definitely can find some really useful bits. As I say, this kind of explains how it's different. The approach of starting with a question, the fact that the order is very different. This bit is particularly useful as a teacher because it summarises each kind of topic, and from there you can map to the A-level course. What's interesting here, I think, is that supply and demand doesn't come until supply and demand doesn't come until Unit 8. Oh, what am I doing? Sorry about that. Supply and demand doesn't come until Unit 8. So before that, a lot of the analysis just doesn't use graphs. It kind of uses intuition, some of which can be really interesting. Or it uses kind of indifference curves, isocost curves, all of that stuff. But that doesn't mean that none of this is going to be useful in your classroom, as we'll see. But this is a good page for you to kind of map out how it links to your scheme of work. Don't ignore the capstone units, is my advice. There's some really nice stuff in here that's either useful on its own as part of the course, or could perhaps kind of be almost standalone projects or whatever after year 12 exams. 100 years of economic history from the Great Depression to the global financial crisis. Some of that is specifically mentioned on the Edexcel spec, but even if you're on other courses, some of that could be kind of potentially quite useful. Right, and then it goes through a bit more kind of explaining how it could be used in universities. But I think the main useful bit on this page for teachers is the kind of explanation at the top and then this sort of summary. So going back, if we just pick a page that would be useful and that is relevant, you can see these kind of themes, by the way, in the kind of colour coded. So picking this one, which I think is mainly about GDP, I think, yeah. So a couple of things here that I think make it relevant to an A-level economics teacher. Firstly, I think this text is very, very understandable. In some ways, I think it's perhaps more accessible than some of the A-level texts are. Very easy to read. The explanations are really, really clear. And because the explanations are really clear, and often they come at things from a slightly different angle than the A-level textbooks, it might help you to refine your explanations. So even if you're not planning on getting students to, on sending students towards this as a reference source, reading it before teaching a topic might just kind of help clarify your own explanations. I know that there's a couple of things that have come up that I thought, oh, I've never thought of explaining it like that before. Again, even if you're not using it, you're not directing students towards it as a resource, it can still be a really useful teacher resource, because there are lots of these little kind of extra resources on the side. So audio files or videos or data or articles, just lots of really nice resources that you might want to tie into your text. I really like that the referencing's done really well, and often these are referenced to like open access resources. So again, even more resources for you. I think I've said resources like 5 times in the last minute. I also like that if you just wanted students to read, say, this section and not the whole chapter, if you just wanted to direct students to just one section, you can link them directly there, copy link address, and it would, and you can send that up via email or VLE or whatever, but then it'll take students to this section specifically, which is pretty useful if you want to tell them what to read. You don't say, scroll down to the 4th paragraph and on the 3rd section or whatever. You can be quite specific. In general, the navigation is really, really good. Just a couple of features here. So, I mean, you can turn it into dark mode to reduce strain on eyes, particularly if you're using it on a board or if students are spending a long time reading from a screen. It comes in a couple of languages, which could potentially be useful for EAL. You can also bookmark. I think the bookmarking is really, really useful as a teacher, because not all of it, not obviously the whole textbook as a whole isn't going to be completely useful every single chapter. So I think it'd be useful to bookmark the sections that are relevant, so that you've kind of got a list of all of those. The search function is very, very good. It's quite powerful. It pops up with everything it should pop up with. So if you need to search for, I don't know, externality, if you know you read something somewhere about externalities and you need to find it, it's pretty useful. The navigation is pretty easy because it's got these kind of drop down menus. Just in general, it's very, very user friendly. Alongside the kind of explanation, you also have exercises and questions and these kind of Einstein units, as they're called. And we're going to talk a bit more about those, I think, now. All these kind of resources are collated together, as well as embedded throughout the test, throughout the kind of text. They are collated together. So you've got all the Einsteins in one place, all the great economists in one place, whatever. So the Einsteins, which you might be wondering what that is, they're largely like mathematical explanations, step by step, really quite accessible. If you've got GCSE maths, you can normally follow them pretty well. There are some more complex mathematical stuff right at the end of the book. I think it might be Leibniz's or something, but that uses calculus that your mathematicians might want to have a look at. But many of our students think mathematically, and sometimes being able to direct them to another explanation that's perhaps a little bit more mathematical might help them. So, for example, which one should we pick? Economies of scale and cost advantages of large-scale economics, which kind of goes through economies of scale in dimensions, which is very kind of followable. What else could we maybe have a look at? If we have a look at maybe the elasticity of demand. So this bit is kind of followable. I probably wouldn't recommend it for all students, but some kids get confused between gradient and elasticity, and being able to kind of walk them through the difference is quite useful. I think a bit further down, it probably goes a bit too far for your first year economists, this kind of stuff. But I think a Year 12 economist could follow that quite easily. So it's quite useful to have as an extra resource. Great economists love this section. It kind of takes key economists and their major ideas, looks at big thinkers. Let's look at Keynes as an example. They're a nice length. They're not too long. Very easy to understand. They're kind of more than a paragraph, but not reams and reams and reams. The writing's very accessible, and it gives you an overview of the historical context, their personal histories, their ideas, their careers, and the relevance today. I think if you're looking to include more history of economic thought, you could do a lot worse as a starting point than these great economist sections. And I also like that it's kind of mapped in some ways to, admittedly, the course spec, but then you can kind of transfer that to your own scheme of work. So these are quite nice. What else have we got? When how economists learn from facts. This kind of looks at economic research and how it works, how we use natural experiments, what we do when we want to observe something that's unobservable, and some interesting outcomes from research as well. I like this one on redistribution and raising living standards of the poor, which was this one. Just really interesting on how economics works in the real world. And I also like there's one on like women's voting. Yeah. This looks at women voting and the impact on child health programs, for example. It's fascinating. I think the disciplinary knowledge of how ideas or concepts become established fact isn't particularly naturally baked into the A level. I think you have to almost add that in yourself and be quite conscious of it. But adding this sort of thing in when it's relevant is a really good way to start introducing students to how the frontier of economic knowledge is actually pushed out, and how economic thought changes. I think that's really interesting. So again, would recommend those. What else have we got? When economists disagree gives you a really nice primer into sources of debate among economists, and I think it acts as an antidote to the belief that students sometimes hold that economics models are infallible and that economists agree and therefore that there is a perfect solution to problems in economics. I think this acts as quite a nice antidote to the fact that people, even at the top of the game, people disagree. Almost all of these articles have some kind of links to the A-level spec in some way. I like this one on climate change and looking at the disagreement between Barrow and Krugman regarding the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I've clicked the one wrong. I didn't mean to click this one. But this one's pretty good too. So this one's about like discount rates and how they disagreed on discount rates. The one on the one that with Krugman and Barrow was the multiplier, and it looked at how these two great economists really disagreed on what the size of the multiplier was, and therefore whether the policy was a good idea or not. So kind of real life decisions. And I particularly like this one because the size of the multiplier is something that lots of students reference as part of their evaluation. So just having a bit more of an idea of how that actually works in practice is useful, I think. Okay, next we're going to look at the exercises. There are reams of these. I really like these. A lot of them are really good kind of thinking or discussion questions. Some of them involve indifference curves or whatever, so some of them you can't use. But a lot of them are worth having a look at, and how you can maybe incorporate that into your planning. They're quite different from many of the questions we ask in class and get to the heart of some quite big topics. Let's have a look at this one. So it's asking, I'll show you this figure in a minute, but why the usage of the term capitalism spikes when it does. Why do you think it's remained so high since the late 1980s? So it kind of looks at this graph. I quite like as well that a lot of the data is linked So you can look at it on Our World in Data, and then you can fiddle around with it a little bit, because it lets you change the dates or whatever, and you can see the data points. Just as an aside, I quite like that. But yeah, some really nice questions. What other questions could we maybe have a look at? I quite like this one as well, about using some of the history as well. So the idea of that the King of England cannot enter, all his forces dare not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement, and about how that applies today in our country, and the meaning of private property, which I think sometimes we sort of skip past a little bit and we just assume as a given. Let's keep going. Next up, we've got the. See, there's loads of exercises. Tons and tons and tons and tons and tons. Oh, next up, we've got videos. Some of these are linked to kind of TED Talks, or I think there's one that links to Golden Balls, whatever. But there's a lot of these really good economist in action videos, which are really well produced. I like the way that the economists are all quite different, and I just really like getting to hear people talk about their thing in economics. So I don't know, looking at this one, for example, what promotes or kills innovation? Again, some really, really nice ones here. I hadn't even kind of come across these videos, but really, really worth it. Highly recommend those. What else have we got? And then finally the figures. So there's a lot of data. So some of it is data, some of it's theoretical graphs. Before Unit 8, the graphs aren't, the theoretical graphs aren't that useful, because a lot of them are kind of, as I say, isocost indifference curves type things. But when you do get to the kind of theoretical graphs that perhaps our students do know, I quite like them in that there. Let's have a look at taxation. Okay. In that they take you through step by step, and we've spoken before about building up graphs in front of students, but this is something that a textbook can't do. It gives you the finished product, whereas I like being able to kind of click through and change things and do it step by step. But there's also a ton of data here as well. There's so much data. Look at this. Just loads and loads of graphs. Really, really interesting. Even if just from your own intellectual curiosity, but I'm sure you can kind of use some of them maybe in your planning. I'm a big fan. I love a bit of data. So I mean that's the economy. There are some other pretty useful things. If we go back to here, for example, okay. So the resource centre, as I say, we're currently logged in as a student. So if you're in as a teacher, then there's even more. But just 2 or 3 other really, really interesting bits, kind of hidden gems down here in View All Resources. Just thinking about it. I think that's my internet might be rubbish. Yeah, I think it is. There we go. So, I mean, there's narrated slides and whatever, but 2 things really, really, really recommend. Financial Times articles mapped to core, which sounds useful in itself, because from core you can then map it to your own curriculum, but it does also map straight to the Edexcel A level. Not so great if you're on the AQA, but you can normally more or less find roughly what you're after. And my internet's really slow, so there we go. But you know, even if you're on another topic, you can probably just about work out what the equivalent topic is. But it maps all the FT articles from, I don't know when, but there's plenty there. And it also maps the Economist articles. And as I say, you know, you can either look straight for the Edexcel mapping, or you can look at the economy mapping and then go from there to your own. But just, how nice is that? Just lots of really interesting articles on a topic. So that's just a very brief kind of run through of core. I'm pretty interested if anyone's using it in their teaching or how they use it. I just think there's a lot of scope there potentially. As I say, even if you're not going to send students to it, in informing our own planning and our own approach and resources and whatever, I think there's quite a few options. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. But if you have used it, I'd be really interested to chat to you about what you've done and what you've used it for.